Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to 1615's final webinar of 2013. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president of 1615 Church Missions Coaching. Today's topic is blazing a church trail through the mission strategy maze. Churches employ a wide variety of strategies in global missions, and others choose to have no strategy at all. Voices call for local churches to partner with nationals, send church-based teams, adopt an unreached people, concentrate on a focus, work for justice, or pursue some other urgent priority. How can church leaders determine what God wants their church to do in global outreach? Is one strategy better than all the rest? Or should a church try to incorporate many of them? Is there a systematic way churches can chart a path that's right for them? Today, we'll talk about the pros and cons of adopting a mission strategy and divide strategies into categories to help clarify the options. Finally, we will discuss some questions churches can use to begin to blaze their trail through the strategy maze and decide next steps. We trust that this webinar will be helpful to you, your church, or your organization. Today's subject matter expert is Ellen Livingood, a very good friend of mine and founder and president of Catalyst Services. Catalyst helps missions organizations and local churches to expand and improve their global efforts by providing in three areas. Resourcing. They offer a wide variety of missions mobilization tools. Connecting. They link and guide partners to maximize their global impact. And training. They prepare missions leaders to navigate today's changing context. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ellen, but first a couple of details. Number one, your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. Two, you can listen through your computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone. Number three, as questions come to mind, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be addressing questions for the last 15 minutes of our time together. 55 people are registered for today's live webinar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for download at 1615.org in the next 2 weeks. Ellen, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Matthew. It's a privilege to be here, and I always enjoy working with you. And I also appreciate all of those of you who have signed up to be a part of this webinar today. Whether or not I'm an expert is questionable, but I will say that this is a topic that I've really been thinking and working on, and I certainly don't feel like it's the final product. So I really welcome your questions and your comments both now and later in terms of how we continue to sharpen our thinking and our practical response in this area. I think we all are learning and growing as we go, and I'm excited about that opportunity to do that with you today. So please feel free to be a part of this, and we want to learn together. So I want to start by thinking about the whole question of stewardship. This is something that has been a growing awareness of mine in this whole question of what does it mean to be a church leader and what's the biblical implications of that for missions and mission stewardship. Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5:17 that leaders in the local church are to direct the affairs of the church well. And certainly doing that includes stewardship of the gifts and resources that God's invested in his body. Jesus gives us a vivid picture of stewardship responsibility when he talks about the parable of the talents. And I believe that it applies to leaders as they steward the amazing resources that God's invested in all of our churches. And by saying that, I don't mean to exonerate individual people of their responsibility for their own stewardship. Certainly, each of us stewards our own gifts. And I also don't mean that in any kind of a guilt-inducing, bang people over the head for what they're not doing kind of implication. But I do think as we look at that parable that there's a challenge to think about what is it that we as leaders, particularly church leaders, will answer for someday as we stand before the Master. And I believe that as we are responsible for our own stewardship, we're also 5-talent stewards for those gifts that God has invested in the church. And while this picture is showing money, certainly it's far more than that. God's given us a responsibility, and what do we steward? How do we steward that? What does it mean to multiply our talents? What kinds of things do church leaders do to engage and utilize and build and grow the talents that God has invested in His people in order to reach the nations? If someday we will give account for that, that means that there are choices that we make now that are going to affect the stewardship and affect what we report in that day. And clearly, not all options are equal. So what does that look like? What does it mean to engage talents, abilities, certainly the monetary aspect, people's time in that task? And on the flip side of that, what does hiding talents in the ground look like? How do we as leaders allow that to happen, and what can we do? If potential is wasted, then it seems like our stewardship is dishonored. So we all want to be stewards and help other church leaders to be good stewards in that prospect. I was interested, again, in looking at that parable that he specifically mentions the fear factor in terms of the steward who buried his talents. And I think that the fear factor is one that we need to think about, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So how can we sort out the issues of stewardship? What does that look like? How do we help church leaders think about stewarding the gifts of God's people well? Well, the next thing that one of the things that I have struggled with, and it took a while for me to sort this out, was we use the word strategic or strategy in a lot of ways. We talk about strategic ministry, and then we talk about strategies. And I, for a long time, I assumed these were all the same things. And then one day, the lights went on, and I realized, aha, these are very different things. We talk about strategic ministry. What we mean is, what is important? What are the things, it's results focused. When we talk about strategies, we're talking about how we get that important stuff done. So there's really two different, very different aspects of that, and yet we tend to muddle them all up together, I think, because we have that strategic thing that goes between them. So for me, at least, it was helpful to clarify the language a little bit and separate them. Now, I know my editing background probably makes me focus on terminology, but I think terminology is important to help us understand and to help us help other people understand in that process. And so I've tried to shift into using the terms talking about priorities as what we do and strategies as how we do it. For me, that was helpful to begin to think through this process in those kinds of ways. So what do we mean by priorities? What are some of the kinds of things? And here's just some examples. Ends of the earth priorities. For some of us, that certainly needs to be front and center. We talk about unreached peoples or unengaged peoples. Catastrophic need is the heartbeat of numbers of people in our younger generations, whether it's trafficking or poverty or malaria or whatever. Windows of opportunities are important priorities. We're thinking about, hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees right now. Certainly that is an illustration of priority. We're watching the nations come to us, and so the Sikhs living in our city or whatever the people that God's brought to us. But as well, sometimes our strength is a priority, and we can think in the positive as well. It points to priorities. In our Focus on the World Manual, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later, we talk about 7 categories, and I don't think that there has to be any particular number, but I think it's helpful to sit down and say, okay, what are the things that we believe that God has, what types of things are priorities for us in that process? So going the step further and thinking about how do we define that? It's certainly a process. I think it's a process that grows out of, first of all, what does the church believe? What's our theology? As we look at Scripture, what does it say? What are our values? What do we feel God has said to us in terms of of things for our church-wide priorities? What's our context? And then, what's the Holy Spirit saying to us? What's the direction that He's giving to us at this time and place? So spirit direction, identification of our church's DNA, discernment of opportunities, these are the kinds of things that we help churches think about as they think about those priorities. Priorities certainly are individualized, as individual as the church is, and so there's no limited list or limited number. God speaks and calls churches, again, out of who He's made them to be and what His purpose has been for them. So an exciting opportunity to walk through that as church leaders, again, thinking about the stewardship of what God has invested in our church. Then thinking a little bit about strategies. If we think about strategies as how to accomplish our priorities, I think it's easy to see there's probably two types. There's field strategies and then there's mobilization strategies. Field strategies are almost always directed from the field, the people who know the situation best, our national partners, national leaders, perhaps expat workers who are there with a good knowledge of what's going on there. But the mobilization side is what I want to focus on here, because it's the side that you and I are most engaged with and I think need to be most responsible for. What are the ways that we can involve our churches, that we can engage what God's invested in them most effectively? So just a kind of overview, I like to kind of break things down into categories in terms of, what needs to come first. And I think, again, there's priorities and then strategies need to be lined up at the beginning. I often find with churches that they want to talk, they're all confused about policies and organizational kinds of issues, or maybe just the nuts and bolts of how to mobilize. But until some of these, in essence, the big rocks are in the jar, as we say, of what are our priorities and what do we think are our key strategies, it's going to be really hard to do those other things, even hard to energize people because we don't know what we're energizing them to. If you want to see a little bit more about that topic, this is all part of our January 2012 postings, which you can find online in the archives for the postings. If you can't find it, feel free to shoot me an email and I'll get it to you. So do we really need priorities and strategies? Is it really important? Because for a long time, everybody was really happy without them. So we didn't talk about those kinds of things. We reacted to opportunities that came our way, or we were asked by denomination or by individual missionaries or mission agency to do something, and churches responded and were very reactive. So what is the rationale for it? Well, I think there's several things that we need to think about. One of the exciting things, I think, is that fact that the church has reawakened to what God's calling them to do. They're looking outward. If we want to call it being missional, for some people that's a negative term, but I think the core concept is a wonderful one. And I think we're in such an incredibly great opportunity to speak into, what does it mean to be missional, to be outwardly focused when we're looking at the world, and to see churches interested in that kind of a conversation is just a wonderful thing in our day. Then also we're looking at global opportunities exploding. We have to think in terms of priorities and strategies because no church can do everything. And if we try to do too much, we're mediocre at everything, and I think that's, again, one of the challenges that we face. So how can we really look at all these opportunities and find out what it is God's calling us to do? And then lastly, just the fact that people in the 21st century, particularly younger generations, but maybe all of us, we long for hands-on involvement. We want a personal connection. We want to make a difference. We want to know that what we're doing really changes someone's life somewhere. And we want to be invested in a cause that we really believe in, that we think is really important. And so those kinds of things are driving a whole new way of looking, and I think an exciting kind of open door for us, whether we're in the church as leaders or whether we're mobilizers, to come alongside and say, in this day of new vision and new opportunities, let's chart a new path. Let's get out of the maze and start doing some exciting things. Matthew, I just want to draw you back into the conversation here. I know that you have a passion to coach churches through a process of defining priorities and strategies. You've used some different terminology, but why do you see that as important? What outcomes do you see as churches move through that kind of a process?
Well, 2 words, Ellen, and you've already shared them: meaningful engagement. Over the years of doing missions coaching, I have run into so many churches who basically did missions and had missions commitments without any type of strategic integration. And so they left the formation of strategy and priority to agencies or individual missionaries, as you mentioned, and they just sent people to the field, and they really didn't understand the strategic need or opportunities. And so as a result, when you just over the years respond to opportunities, and again, I'm just repeating what you said, and that might seem right at first, just responding to those things. You mentioned happily reactive, I think you said. But the end result is a shotgun-like effect that people can't understand. It's impersonal and it's unengaging, and it really doesn't capture their hearts or their minds. So I think the more specific a world missions vision is, the more it's going to attract commitment and draw people's attention. And then that leads to that piece that you mentioned of involvement. There's a dictum that I use a lot. It goes like this: tell me and I will forget, show me and I will remember, involve me and I will understand. And when a church has this shotgun approach, it's really hard to get involved. But when they have determined priorities and strategies, not only is there focus, but those strategies enable everybody to grab onto the vision, and missions becomes very personal. So meaningful engagement, I think, is the thing that really resonates with me, that relates to priorities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It brings it down from a they're doing something to a we're doing something. Let me just summarize a few things in that same area, and just a couple of illustrations that may be helpful in that process. Thinking about some of the internal benefits, obviously what we're doing, again, first of all, is for the glory of God. It's for the benefit of the nations and the blessing of the nations. But I think it's very acceptable to also say what strategies help us to be all God's made us to be. That's going to accomplish those other things in the process as well. And one of the things that I just love to think about is how priorities and strategies unite a church around an unfinished story. Whether it's from the Arabian Nights stories on down to today, there's just something powerful about a story, and particularly an unfinished story, that suddenly we can walk into, that draws us into it. I think of, for instance, Yongnok Presbyterian Church in Toronto, young Korean Canadians, English-speaking congregation growing out of a Korean-speaking congregation. But a few years ago, God just got their heart around a particular country in Central Asia, and they became part of this unfinished story, and they saw themselves as significant players in that story. And they've sent long-term workers, they've repeatedly been sending short-term teams. Many other people have been there. They've done significant things of member care for some of their workers who've really come home wounded at particular times and needed ministry. And in all of that, God has brought them into that and united them around that. They've moved on now. They've broadened and have some other kinds of priorities as well. But God continues to show them what He's doing in that particular country and what their role in that is. And that's just motivational and brings them together around a sense of calling. Another thing is the whole concept of winning the attention of the unengaged. And by unengaged, I mean the unengaged people in the church. So often we're thinking about, okay, we've got this little core of missions people. How do we make it a little bigger? But I think we need to look and say, what's a big vision picture that will engage the hearts of the people out there in the fringe, or the people who come on Sunday or the weekend and that's all we see of them. And more the same is not going to do that. We use too much missions language, and we talk about too many different missionaries. It's wonderful to have lots of missionaries, but people cannot get their head around that if they're not already committed to mission. So how can we focus, again, on that singular story or a couple of limited number of stories that sort of, in essence, makes an unspoken contract between people that says, we're not going to overwhelm you with 50 different stories. Will you give us your attention? Will you walk with us into the story of what God is doing in this one or two places, and let down the barriers so that we can share together in that kind of a thing. It's exciting to see that happen. We build we energy, and just an illustration of that one. Wooddale Church a number of years ago adopted the country of Bulgaria, and one aspect of that was a partnership that they developed with a national entity that was trying to help women out of prostitution and out of some difficult backgrounds. And one of the things they wanted to do was help these women to start some businesses. And so Wooddale came back, and they began to recruit women entrepreneurs from their congregation, women who probably in other contexts wouldn't have had an interest in missions, but because they could take their particular gift and see how it applied in helping the women in Bulgaria, it began to transform their lives as well as the lives of the people that they were working with. And they developed friendships and repeated relationships over repeated visits. And there was an energy that's come from that is built out of, again, that unity around a calling and around priorities that has just been transformational in the lives of the people involved. Another thing that I really loved was several years ago, a church in California adopted people in East Asia and began to send people. And their pastor said to me, he said, one of the most exciting things that I've seen come out of this priority has been people praying bigger prayers. I just love that. I think if there's anything we need in the church today, it's praying bigger prayers. And I knew exactly what he meant, because it's when you get there and you see the enormity of the need, but also you begin to see the vision and what God's doing and what God can do through you, you begin praying in different ways. And I think that's a tremendous challenge and a really exciting aspect of this. And then I think we create paths for objective decisions. So many times when we're reactive, we're reacting to every individual opportunity, and that can be very uncomfortable because it can become very personal. And so we can make objective decisions if we've laid out clear priorities and strategies. That's not to say they're easy decisions, because sometimes in setting priorities and strategies, we have to say no to some good things, but it's important that we do have a way to do that well. And then lastly, we set the stage for celebration. And I just love this because I don't think we celebrate in missions nearly enough. If the sports world did as little celebrating as the missions world did, nobody would go to games. It's all about celebrating, and Scripture is about celebrating what God has done. And Paul wrote to many of his letters, he was celebrating with the people who were part of his ministry and what God was doing. And Northridge Church adopted a number of years ago one of the hardest to reach people groups, and they prayed, and eventually God chose to send their senior pastor as a long-term worker. And he told me about how one of his commitments was to keep those people involved and to share with them as if they were there what God was doing. And as God just did miraculous things and brought people literally to their door in miraculous ways, the church celebrated because they were a part of that. And that celebration was motivational. Even when things were slow and hard, God built the people into the process because they were a part of it, and because they could celebrate what God was doing, as they had a clear understanding of what they were doing and how they were going about it. So that's just some of the benefits and just some illustrations. But we come back to the fact that, okay, that's all great, but it's still a maze. How do we find our way through it? What are some of the things that we can do to sort out what God's calling us to and how to do it? Before we do that, however, I'll just take just a couple of minutes to talk about that fear factor. I would guess that many of you are like me, and we tend to be rational, and we want to help. We take churches through a rational process, and we say, okay, here's step A, B, and C, and understand this, and move along here, and we'll come out with a good result. And I think that's important. I think that's a good way to look at things. But I also am reminded pretty consistently that the best rationale in the world does not work if people have an emotional barrier set up. If they feel that there's failure that is going to be inevitable or an outcome that they're uncomfortable with. So we need to work through those kinds of things. And just mention a few of those things. The one that we probably hear the most is, okay, you're going to, you're taking us in this new direction, and I just know, you're going to cut our missionary support, and I love these people, and you can't do this, and they just dig in their heels before you start because they fear that something that they really love is being threatened. I think we need to help people understand that that's not the heart of what we're trying to do. Now, it's true that there are times when we need to do some house cleaning. I personally think it's better to launch some positive things first and then later maybe go back and do some house cleaning after people understand and get a picture and a part of something exciting that's moving forward. But regardless, we're not trying to change the commitments of the people at the core who are already excited about missionaries. Basically, we want them to keep loving the missionaries they love. We want them to keep supporting the projects they're on. Again, what our focus is all those people out there on the fringe who aren't involved at all. And so if we can help people understand that we're not threatening the things that they love or the people that they're committed to, that's not the core of what we're looking at, and help them to understand, get past some of that emotional barrier. The other thing I hear a lot is, this is hopeless, our pastor's not supportive, we often hear the pastor's not missions minded, whatever, we can't do anything. This is a tough one. I personally think that we need to understand that, yes, a pastor's support, involvement, ownership is extremely important, but if we don't have that, we need to keep moving and do what we can and pray that God will change the heart of that pastor in the process. The interesting thing is that at a number of times, I have had pastors say to me privately, I would love to be more supportive of missions. I'd love to get excited about missions, but I don't think the missions committee is doing anything that's going to excite our people. So there's, we look at this from two perspectives. Let's say, let's sit down together. Let's not be protective. Let's say, hey, how can we together, again, practice kind of stewardship that's going to be a win-win in the process. And I find many pastors are ready to come alongside of that as we invite them to speak into it and be a part of leading us in new directions of priorities. And then one more, we can't get people to all those meetings. And I grant, this is another challenging one, but I think we need to change the question. I think we need to say, how do we make a meeting that people want to come to? And if we talk about things that are really life-changing, if people have an opportunity to speak into things and be a part of transformational change, I think they want to show up. Maybe we need to think differently about how we schedule planning time and how we use time in meetings, what that looks like, or even what has to happen in a face-to-face versus what can happen virtually. We need to be creative about those kinds of things, but I think we can't say this is a showstopper. If God wants us to do this, then we can find a way to get people involved in the process. Let's be creative about that. So that brings us back to then the question, well, it's just confusing. There's options, there's this and that. How do we sort through it? So how do we figure out the way through the maze? Let's just look quickly. I think that all of you have had an opportunity to get the postings that we did recently and have this chart. I'm not going to go through it, but I want to refer back and forth to it a bit. First, let me say some disclaimers on it. It's not intended to be, something that covers everything. Could there be another strategy? I'm sure there is. There's probably lots of other strategies. I think these are pretty much cover a lot of the basic ones that churches have been looking at in the last few years, but it's not intended to be complete, so if you want to add to it, that's fine. Another thing I think that we need to recognize as we talk about priorities and strategies in general is that the Holy Spirit works by His own set of priorities, and I think that He calls us to be organized and systematic and plan well. At the same time, He always does things outside of our box. Someone said to me recently that they heard a quote that said, following the Holy Spirit is like following a driver that doesn't use turn signals. God does different things, and we have to be open to times when He will do things outside of our plan. But at the same time, I think by planning and by being systematic, we can handle those kinds of things better, and we can overall pull things into a more well-stewarded process. I think strategies work well in combination, and we can talk about that. Just going to quickly go down through these and just say, again, probably the most common strategy for churches has been not to have any at all. And again, I think that we need to move out of that one. That's probably the only one that I think is counterproductive in totality. Education, that's always been a fallback, and I still hear churches who say, well, we're just going to make sure that we have a really good missions conference, or we just really want to get people to perspectives, or, we really want to, it's a focus on education, and then we hope that they'll get involved and something will happen. And God, by His grace, does that. He uses His Word. Obviously, that's not lacking in motivation, but I think it's mostly insufficient. We need to have pathways for people to respond and a place to go. As far as investment, there's many that are saying partnering with nationals or embrace individual visions. And if those are exclusive, I think they can be too limiting. In other words, if we only partner with nationals, what happens to the go command? If we are going to embrace every individual vision and everything's equal, we end up, again, back with chaos in many cases. And yet both of those are great things. We do want to partner with nationals, and we do want to empower people. So put within a context, they can be helpful. In deployment, we can send our own, and it's exciting to see churches being more proactive in what that means in preparation and sending. Or the newest one on that list is the whole concept of deploying kingdom professionals. What does that look like, and how do we do it? And then the last ones are adopting a cause and focusing on strategic initiatives. And most of you who know us know that Catalyst focus on the world, and what 1615 is doing with the 3D program really fit into that, helping people think about focusing on a particular ministry or a particular initiative. The cause being more narrow as far as ministry or need, but wider geographically. A strategic initiative being more involving more kinds of ministries, but focused in a more narrow place in general. Again, these all have strengths and weaknesses. Many times in combination with others, they can be most effective. I think one of the dangers is saying we want to do them all. We may want to do them all, but if we try to do them all and we try to do them all well, I think we often end up in the point of burning out leaders and, again, succeeding at mediocrity because we're really not looking at how we bring it all together. So, Matthew, I'm going to come back to you. How do you react to this kind of a list? What do you think is missing, or what would you add in terms of clarification?
Well, can I lift it? First of all, I really like it, Ellen. I think you've done a thorough job of thinking through some strategies here. I'm going to circle back to something you said, maybe just for clarification's sake. I think most churches are probably going to employ a variety of the strategies in a particular focus or area. Yeah, I agree with you. You don't want to do all 7 of them. I think that's a mistake. But even when a church has an overarching strategic purpose or priority, as you might call it, I think some of these strategies might have a combination. For example, I'm working with a church that's focusing on North Africa, and I would say they fit into the number 7 piece. They're wanting to plant churches in a given region in North Africa, but they are actually using business for transformation, or business as mission, number 5 on your list, as a part of that overarching picture. So I think in most cases you're going to see a combination, and again, I want to reinforce what you said. I think doing all 7 is going to be a problem, or any other numbers that aren't listed there, strategies that are on there, but probably going to have a couple of different types of strategies combining towards an overall priority in a place. Or I would also say that, let's say a church has kind of a portfolio of focus areas. Ellen, you and I have talked about this. Maybe they have 2 or 3 strategic people groups or places that they're zeroing in on. Maybe one's in Central America. Maybe they've got an unreached people group in India. I think different strategies will be used in different field contexts. So I like what you've done here. I think it's a great thing for people to think through. I would just say probably some type of combination. I would say a limited combination of these is probably what most churches are using that I work with.
Yeah, that's good. I think I suggested in the postings that I would suggest that, maybe there's a primary one that you're really all out on, and then there's at least 1 or 2 others that you're working on.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that you can't be using some of the others at the same time, but you can't necessarily be really focusing on developing and really pouring a lot of energy into all of them at once, I think, is my concern in that process. There's certainly an educational process going on all the time, but there are times when maybe it's not focused on that as much as some of the other things. So that's good. Yeah, and it definitely does relate back to what are the priorities, because that will help to say what do we need to, what's needed most in that particular area. Well, our time's moving on. Let me move forward quickly on a couple more things. Choosing strategies. And here's just some questions to think about. There's some, again, in the postings as well. Is there a specific strategy suggested by our priorities and priorities? We just talked about that. What strategies would best expand our global capacity? In other words, if we have not been doing a lot with sending, but we have a capacity, we look at people in our church, maybe we really need to focus there. Maybe we've got business people or other professionals so there's capacity building in a particular area. Does our primary strategy have a weakness that could be addressed by another? Sometimes, again, if we're really looking at a focus area, but we haven't done a very good job of building people's skills, then maybe we really need to say, hey, how can we empower people better to get started where they are even in order to be ready to mobilize in a greater way? What strategies would you feel especially drawn to? Again, sometimes churches just have a passion for something that's a fit. And then, do we already have 1 or more leaders for a particular strategy? Is there someone who has a passion to deploy professionals? Maybe they are one, and they say, we just need to see how we can get business people or others out there. It's a great way for God to be pointing in a particular direction. One of the questions I think as we look at all of this then is, when is shifting of priorities and strategies constructive, or when is it destructive? How much do we lock things in, or for how long, or what does that look like? We love to try new things. We like to think of ourselves on the cutting edge. By the way, there is no iPhone 6, but everybody's already lined up to buy one, kind of thing, or the people who like to be early adopters. At the same time, what we find that in missions, we need to recognize we've got a long learning curve. So if we're focusing on a particular priority, we're developing an ability, a capacity, and a strategy. There's a lot to be learned when we're looking at doing things cross-culturally. So how do we help our people? How do we help church leaders understand what it takes to stick with it long enough to do it well? When most of the world is focused around relationships, and those relationships take time to build, how can we build longevity, sustainability into our side of the picture? I think this is a really important question for us to wrestle with, whether we're mobilizers or whether we're church leaders. How do we not prematurely drop something just because it's hard, or just because the partnership's struggling, relationships are rocky, or something else new has come along that people are just really excited, oh, let's go off and do that. How do we help people think through the need to stick to something long enough, while at the same time we want to be flexible, we want to respond to new things that the Spirit's bringing to us? How do we think through those things as we think about time frames, as we think about relationships, as we think about leadership changes in that process? Where do we, when we get a new leader, whether it's a senior pastor or a missions pastor, how do we talk about the whole area of what things do we expect them to own from the past because we've got a commitment to them, or where do we just say, hey, we're on a new page and we move on? I think those kinds of things are important to talk about, and there's no clear, this is how it always needs to come down, it doesn't seem to me. Matthew, what's your feeling on that? How do you see the flexibility on one side and the longevity, commitment, sustainability on the other side? How have you seen those play out?
Yeah, there is always a pushback from some people. They have that fear factor when you start talking about priorities and focus. As you mentioned, they're concerned about missionaries no longer being supported. And I think they're afraid that they won't be able to address new opportunities as they arise. And one of the things that I talk about is having priorities and strategies as a part of that priority. It isn't indefinite. It's not like you're never going to move out of that field or focus. Right. In fact, I think what's inherent to having a priority and a strategy is that there is a time where you're going to begin to ratchet down your involvement in that place or in that people group. As the mission starts to reach fulfillment, you're going to transition out, and I've seen churches do that, Ellen, and then they will then add another focus. They say, God, we prayed, you moved, our people rallied, and the mission you called us to do, it's starting to take root in this people group. And of course, this doesn't mean that you disappear and you no longer have a relationship with those people, but the level of engagement changes. So that's one of the things I mentioned to churches, is that developing a focus and priorities doesn't mean you won't add new stuff later. There will be those new initiatives that you'll come behind. But one of the things I think having priorities and focus does, Ellen, when those new opportunities arise, I think it helps church leaders and missions leaders to respond to those new requests for funding or support or involvement by stopping and praying and evaluating. And I think they should ask the question, if we take on this new thing, will it impede our ability to fulfill our mission in existing focus areas? Or will it dilute the awareness and understanding we're trying to create as a congregation? So I think those are some of the ways those play out. And then I would also just want to reinforce something you said. I believe in the power of focus. I believe that the Great Commission itself is strategic. I mean, God gave us a mission that is finishable, and I believe Matthew 24:14 reinforces that. And without thinking through the strategic implications of the gospel, we'll go anywhere and everywhere. And I think we should more and more say, God, where are you calling us to be your channel of blessing? Where do those strategic opportunities remain? And God, we're not going to stop laboring in that field until those things are accomplished. So again, I want to emphasize the importance of perseverance. You've already hit on it, Ellen. I'm not at all against churches, entertaining new opportunities. Maybe that is the Spirit of God moving. But I have encountered so many field workers, missionaries, indigenous churches, agencies, and when they hear about a church that's wanting to, focus, as it were, in their field, one of the first things they say is, how long will this church be here? And how long is their partnership going to last? And what they're saying basically is, I've heard this before, and there's churches that have, they've said they wanted to partner, they wanted to work with us, but then after a year they disappeared. And so churches have a reputation of being fickle. With all due respect, I love local churches, I work with them, but I think that perseverance piece, Ellen, is so important. And sometimes new opportunities can distract you or detract you from these things that you've made commitment towards.
That's great.
Is that what you were looking for, Ellen?
Absolutely. I think that's just so important. The only thing I would add to that, too, is that we need to see that as we're going into something, there are longer-term commitments and shorter commitments. Maybe if a church is at the beginning of this kind of process, they need something that's more of a, I'll use the word quick win, although that perhaps is not the best terminology. But in other words, something that they do say, hey, we can 2 or 3 years that we can finish that priority and then move on to something. Or maybe if they're looking at something that's really long-term. I mean, if you're talking about seeing an unengaged people group reach, that's a long-term commitment. Thinking about the implications of that, and maybe then alongside of that commitment, alongside of that focus, they have another focus that is shorter, and those kinds of things can kind of be complementary as well. So I think what we're saying is challenging church to think about what it means to stay long enough to be significant while also being perhaps in another aspect of things being able to respond quickly. Our time's about up. Let me just move quickly to some action steps here that I would like to challenge our listeners to think about. How do we move a church in a productive process of engaging powerful priorities and strategies? Do we have models of more traditional churches moving from reactive to proactive, or good models of contemporary churches who develop a global story that's really meaningful? I think that we need to be telling more stories like that. Some of you are doing a lot of that. Some of you are just beginning to develop your own stories. Some of you are maybe looking for stories of other churches like your church, and I think that can be really a positive thing. In our focus on the world, there's lots of stories, and people always say, oh, the stories are the best part. I think we all love stories, and it's really helpful. Another action point, how do we build appropriate flexibility and sustainability into a church's priorities and strategies? How do we think about that? If you look at a skyscraper, it's obviously got to be stable, but it also has to be flexible. It will not stand if it doesn't have some flexibility in it. So how do we balance those two? If you're a mobilizer, how do you help churches with these issues, given your other responsibilities? I know that consistently church mobilizers are saying, I want to work with churches through these issues, but I have so many churches on my list. How do we help them? How do we give them individual time? How do we help them with other kinds of tools or resources that help? If we think this is important, then where is it going to fit and how? And if you're a church leader, what specific steps do you want to take to make this more than just one more seminar? And I know how easy it is to, in essence, stack it on the shelf, but how can we do that, and how can we help you do that? Matthew and I want to be a part of helping churches and agencies to move forward in very proactive ways. So the last question is just, how do we together blaze a trail so hundreds, thousands of churches can make and implement powerful global strategies? So that's a challenge that I conclude with. I think we need to blaze some trails. I think we need to have some illustrations and some pathways for people to follow, but we all need to keep learning because we're all still figuring out how it works. Back to you, Matthew.
Ellen, thank you very much for that insightful information, and thank you for your heart. Got some questions already posted here, and we're going to take the next 10 or 15 minutes, and if we overshoot the hour, I just want to let everyone know if you need to drop off, of course you can do that. We wouldn't know if you left anyway. Actually, we do know when you leave that your number goes down in here, but feel free to do that. But if we're getting enough questions, I'll keep them going for maybe 5 or 10 minutes beyond the hour if you want us to do that. So let me see here. I didn't have any questions posted. Those were our comments to you. So for the numbers of you that are online still, if you would like to ask Ellen a question, or myself as well, in the lower portion of that GoToWebinar box, you can type in your questions in the chat section. So I'm going to...
Or if you have a comment or a suggestion, that's great.
I've got some, Ellen, here. Would you suggest partnering with other churches in your area who might be using different but complementary missions strategies? That comes from Christopher Eichen. So would you consider working with churches in the area who might be using different but complementary mission strategies?
I think that's a great illustration of the body of Christ working well together. I think that the key there is complementary and how those can be brought together, but no one church has everything, and no one church has the ability to build capacity for everything. And so if we can come together, it encourages churches to see what they can do so much more together, so that sometimes it takes more leadership because it's not always easy. In fact, it's usually harder to do it together than it is individually, but I think many times we miss what God wants to do because we want to do our own thing, and it's so great when we can come together to do that. Great question.
Ellen, Joey Garner asks, could prayer in and of itself be a part of your strategy list? Could it be a strategy that churches might employ?
I guess I just see prayer as so essential to everything that I didn't put it down as a separate item. But if a church is looking at its priorities and recognizing that they're not ready to incorporate, or they need some more help to really build it into the very essence of what they're doing, that's a great suggestion, and maybe it is worth adding it as a separate item. I just don't want to see it as optional for anybody, but it's a great suggestion because I think, and I could get off on my soapbox on this, but I'm really concerned that we are raising up generations that have not been taught intercessory prayer. Many cases don't understand spiritual warfare, and many of the challenges that we want to take up and the priorities that we want to adopt are going to demand a commitment to and an understanding of prayer that we probably don't have in many churches. So that's such an important point, and we have to give it more proactivity. So it's a good one. We ought to sort of write it in every box there.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Someone asks if these slides will be available. Yes, they will be available at 1615.org in the next 2 weeks. And I believe, Ellen, you're also going to post them on Catalyst Services. The entire audio-video presentation will be available. Ellen, you're going to love this question. First, there's a thank you from someone, so you are welcome, both from Ellen and myself. But this person says, it's Ken Warnock, as a church mobilizer, one of the hardest people to convince about strategic church partnerships is the mission field. Ellen, do you have any suggestions?
Ken, you're way too brutally honest. It's true. It's true that I phrase that by saying there's 3 rails to partnership. One is the church, one is the field, and one is sort of the administrative logistical support side of it. And I agree that the field rail of those 3 is the hardest, and we need to build them out together or we run the train off the tracks. And as I've often admitted, I have done that on several occasions by having one of those 3 rails not laid out sufficiently when I was trying to run my train down the track. Now, in the defense of missionaries, I also understand why it's been hard. They were not sent out, most of them, with that job description. They were sent out to do a job, not to facilitate somebody else doing it. Those things are very different. They've had some bad experiences with churches. We understand that. They've had some bad experiences maybe from the agency side. We understand that. I think we need to reapproach the question together and learn together through it. But probably that's the hardest point and the place where I think we often need to start. Before we even start engaging the church for a particular partnership, we need to say, hey, how do we help missionaries or national partners build their capacity to utilize the church well, because if not, we have some real crash and burn situations. So good point, Ken.
Ellen, Charles asks, let's see, how do you respond to a church member who is led to a particular mission and affirmed by the missions committee as having been led, but it's not part of the mission strategy? So they've been affirmed by a particular missions committee, but they're not part of a church mission strategy. That's actually from Andy.
Yeah, that's where I was saying that I think we need to be flexible, that the Holy Spirit does not work within our boxes. While I still believe that boxes are important in strategy, by that I mean setting priorities and establishing strategies and things like that. I think we need to recognize that all around that, if that's the heart and that's driving and that's building our church's passion for and involvement in missions, that's key. But God is still going to be calling people to do stuff outside of those areas. And I hope that the church has room for that. If indeed, as you say, it's important that there's an affirmation that the person is gifted and qualified and ready for and called to, something, and that again has within itself is a priority and is something that's really strategic. How that fits, and for many churches, they have established kind of in the financial area of saying, okay, here's our first priorities, and if you're going to our area of priority, you're going to have more support maybe, but yes, we'll affirm that and that we will be a part of that, and I think that's healthy for the church. It may be that person is leading into an area that's going to be the church's next focus or an additional focus or an additional cause that they're going to adopt down the line. So they may just be the front runner of that. So we do need to be flexible at the same time that we don't lose our focus, and then say, how much can we do for this person without losing the focus? And I think one of the things, and churches have said to people in that outside of our strategy or outside of our priority, we will support you and we'll give you missionary care and those kinds of things, but you've got to understand you're not going to get a lot of airtime up front because, again, we are focused on that singular story because we are using the story to pull in the people on the fringe, and we cannot give them too many stories. So we'll help you get a small group that's excited about you. We're all supportive in terms of you building your advocate team or whatever that looks like within the church context, but, we're not going to show a video about you every 3 months or something like that, So those kinds of things and again, clarifying it up front ahead of time so that people don't feel like it's personal for them is really important. So both and with some structure.
Let me speak to that really quickly. So I've worked with many churches that have developed, what I would call a strategic portfolio of priorities, places, people groups, and they've really determined what God has called them to accomplish in those places, and they talk about them, they emphasize them, because again, they're not talking about 75 different unrelated things, during the course of a year. They're focusing, they're telling stories, they're giving opportunities, they're celebrating. And before long, the people in the congregation, that's exactly where they want to go, whether it's short-term or if the long-term opportunity exists. So one of the benefits of having, we didn't mention it earlier, but having priority is that meaningful engagement turns into interest. And of course, you're still going to get opportunities that aren't a part of your church's focus. But if you're talking about it consistently, you're celebrating, you're telling those God stories, I find that that's where people are attracted to. That's where they want to go. And also related to that, I have to share the story. I was working with a church several years ago, and as we were helping them really think about, who are we when it comes to missions, what are our passions, our convictions, they kept talking about relationship. They said, we're a relational church, relational. And as we went through the process, they said, part of that is inclusiveness. We just want to include everyone. We're relational. And I realized that in many ways this value that they were expressing, Ellen, was just an expressed value. It didn't really have an effect on reality. So when I saw this happening, I thought, there's a lesser value here that's not being surfaced. And I asked a few key questions, and I remember the senior pastor said, I get where you're coming from. He said, I'm the reason, that we've been so shotgun and just saying yes to people, and I've been calling it relationship all the time. But what I asked him was, how deep are your relationships with those, 50, 60, 70 missionaries? And he said, we don't have a relationship with them. And so, I think there's a concern about focus and priority in cutting missionaries, but I like to surface to people, if you're spread so thin and you've said yes to, so many needs and opportunities, can you really have meaningful relationships with missionaries? And it may seem counterintuitive, but sometimes saying no to certain, missionaries, certain opportunities, it's going to take relationships to a new level in your church because you can focus. So I just wanted to key on that really quickly.
Good point.
Any comments from you, Ellen? You got
just one quick thing is that, people talk about having some kind of a strategic focus or, an adopted group or whatever, but they're still sending a lot of short-term teams to a place that's close by, again, many times it's Haiti or it's Mexico, and then wondering why people get called to Haiti and Mexico. I'm not saying you don't have a place where you give people an initial experience of missions. There can be value to that, but we need to make sure that we're trying our best to move people on and up and then pointing toward involvement in places where we feel God's called us to really have a significant footprint in the world.
Yes, good. This is from Marty, and she says, I thought that it was a helpful approach to integrating the church's focus with that of their supported missionaries. I don't know if we spoke about that at all, but you want to just comment on that, Ellen? So in other words, when you're developing priority focus, look to the places you're already working.
I think that's a logical place to start, and if you see things in your focus on the world, that's one of the things that we suggest, that you look at what you're already doing, whether it's something project-oriented or whether it's a missionary you've sent out or a national that you're partnering with that's doing something significant. Those are logical places to start. Why, if you're already involved in 20 different places, there's no need to add 21. If one of those 20 or several of those 20 are really key ministries, that's certainly a logical place to look.
Ellen, I'm going to give you one more. I've got quite a few coming, but I realize we need to begin wrapping it up, and then I want to make sure we mention our upcoming webinars and a few other things. So this is from Tammy, and she got a great question, great way to end this. She asks, how would you help a church move from having no strategy / being reactive to recognizing the need for strategy, priority, and focus? So they're reactive. How do you help them move to understand the value of this, Ellen?
Tell stories. Again, sometimes I'll go along and I've got my PowerPoints and I've got my bullet points, but what people want to hear is, how does a church like us, why did it, what did they do and why did it work for them? And the more that church is like the church you're talking to, the greater the power there is, I think, in that kind of a process. We all love to hear stories of how things have worked in other places, and it's the most motivational thing there is. The other thing then, I think, is that offer to walk alongside them. It's easy to lose the process. There's stuff you have to do, life happens and missions budgets have to be done, etc. If you have somebody who's walking alongside and says, I'm going to call you in a month and find out how you're doing on that, there's accountability in that, there's encouragement in that, there's friendship and relationship in that, and that gives people a stimulus to go ahead and do it, I think, as well. So.
You mentioned stories, Ellen. There is a couple of videos on our website. One is called One Church's Journey, and the other is called The Key. The Key to Unlocking Your Church's Mission Potential is the full name. So The Key in One Church's Journey. and those are on 1615.org, and they are short videos that talk about a church, two churches that went through a process of clarifying global vision, of defining priorities, and really mobilizing their congregation to work in these global focus areas. And it talks about the impact and the transformation that it had on the church. And one of the testimonies is from a pastor, and he said, you know, it's interesting, the impact in our congregation is far greater right now than the impact we're having in the field. And of course, you want to see that shift, but he had this recognition by becoming globally focused and having these priorities and mobilizing our people, it's changing our church. And I just thought that was a beautiful statement. The other one just talks about the impact and the leveraged giving and prayer as a church focus. Now, Ellen, you have some videos too, I believe, in your series. Is there any access to those? You talk about stories, and I think those are great mobilization tools.
Yeah, if you probably advancing it, that takes us, segues us into the resources. And your focus on the World Manual is available. Actually, the full manual helps a church think about from the very beginning of what are our priorities and strategy built around a focus. The implementation guide is for those churches that already have their priorities set but want to help in implementing them. But the FocusHelp.org site has a video that you can find there on Cool River Church, and it's a church plant. It was a brand new congregation, and they showed how they could do it, and it's kind of, if we can do it, you can do it sort of thing. So it's a great motivational story about one church that was committed to having an impact in the world and how God used them. And then 1615, our website is right there, 1615.org. It has those videos I mentioned. They could be catalytic and, you know, stirring hearts of leaders and missions leaders to see the power of a focus. And our 3D process, I'm not going to go into great detail, but it's discover, design, deploy. It's about a 5 to 9 month process depending on your church. We've learned every church is different, so we don't have a set in stone number of months, but it's usually 5 to 9 months. And we help a church clarify where it's at, where God's calling it to go. That's the discover. The design is building a strategic implementation plan, very tactical, mobilizing the church inside, and then the external mobilization as well. And then we help them deploy their vision. And it's interesting, Ellen's focus is discover, partner, implement. So we have a lot of similarities in what we do. Please take a look at those resources. And then some upcoming events. We want to tell you about the Church Partner Forum, which is going to be in Orlando, Florida, pioneers.org. You can find out more about that. Ellen is doing one that's, I think, next week, but I'm pretty sure that it's full at this point. You could get on the website and check. But I believe the one in March does have some open seats available. Pioneers is a great organization, and it really is a partner forum. They want to hear from missions leaders and pastors. There's a lot of dialogue and a lot of conversation, a lot of listening on the part of Pioneers. Whether or not you have missionaries in partnership with them, this would be a great place for you to go. So I want to mention that. Get on that website. We have a conference. It's a one-day conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it's called Reduce. And the idea is that the enormity of the unfinished task demands less of us, and I hope that is intriguing to you, and you get on the website and learn more. We'll have promotional materials for that in the next couple of weeks. But it is a one-day event. If you happen to be in the area, you're from the Southwest, we hope you'll come to that. I think it's going to be very powerful. And then we have an upstream webinar coming up. Our next webinar will be in January of 2014, and our subject matter experts will be Larry McCrary and Caleb Kreider of Tradecraft. They've got an excellent book. It's called Tradecraft for the Church on Mission, and they're going to be talking about skills that can be disseminated and trained to your entire congregation, missionary skills that can help them be more effective in evangelism here locally and also missions abroad. I'm looking forward to that. And I'll just close with this slide here. It's got contact information for 1615 and for Catalyst Services. I'll leave that up for the next several minutes. I want to thank everyone for participating today. It's a pleasure to serve you. And Ellen, thank you again for your time and energy that you put into this. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thank you for listening.